The air inside the grand ballroom of the Vitale estate was thick with the scent of gardenias and old money. Elena Moretti adjusted the strap of her camera harness, the leather digging into the curve of her shoulder, where sweat had already begun to pool. She had photographed over 200 weddings in her decade-long career, but this one felt different. This one felt like walking into a cage, where the bars were made of crystal chandeliers, and the locks were the cold, calculating eyes of every guest who watched her move through the room. The bride, Alessandra Vitale, soon to be Alessandra Conti, though the name felt like a lie even before Elena understood why, stood on a raised platform near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her gown a cascade of ivory silk and hand-sewn pearls that probably cost more than Elena's entire apartment. She was beautiful in the way a scalpel was beautiful, sharp, precise, and designed to cut. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate twist, and her lips were painted the color of dried blood. She was laughing at something one of her bridesmaids said, a sound that tinkled like ice in a crystal glass, and then her gaze swept across the room and landed on Elena. The laughter stopped. Elena felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. She had been on the receiving end of dismissive looks before. She was a plus-size woman in an industry that worshipped thinness, a photographer who was supposed to be invisible, but whose body refused to comply. She had learned to armor herself in professionalism, to let the cold glances slide off her like water. But Alessandra's look wasn't dismissive. It was predatory. "You!" Alessandra said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the kind of authority that made the string quartet falter for half a beat. The photographer. "Come here." Elena's second shooter, a wiry young man named Marco, with nervous eyes and a perpetually smudged lens, shot her a worried glance. They had worked together for 3 years, and he knew as well as she did that when a bride used that tone, something unpleasant was about to happen. Elena gave him a small nod. "Stay here, keep shooting," and walked toward the platform, her camera bouncing against her chest with each step. The walk felt longer than it was. The marble floor seemed to stretch, and every guest she passed turned to watch her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. She was used to being looked at, but not like this, not like she was a spectacle. She kept her chin up, her shoulders back, and when she reached the platform, she met Alessandra's eyes without flinching. "Yes?" Elena said, her voice steady. Alessandra's smile was a thin, curved thing. "You're sweating," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "It's dripping onto your camera. Do you always perspire this much? Or is it just the exertion of carrying all that weight around?" A ripple of laughter moved through the bridesmaids. One of them, a blonde with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, covered her mouth with a manicured hand. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. She had been fat her entire life. She had been mocked for it since elementary school, had learned to endure the comments about her size, her eating habits, her worth. But it never stopped hurting. It just became a pain she knew how to hide. "I'm working," Elena said, her voice calm. "The lighting in here is warm, and I've been moving for 3 hours. Sweating is a normal physiological response." Alessandra's eyes narrowed, just slightly, as if she hadn't expected a response that wasn't an apology. "Well, try to control your physiology," she said. "This is my wedding, and I don't want it ruined by a photographer who looks like she just ran a marathon. Maybe stand near the air conditioning vent, if you can find one that fits." More laughter. Elena's jaw tightened. She could feel Marco's gaze on her from across the room, could feel the weight of every guest's attention. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would wipe the smirk off Alessandra's perfect face, but she had bills to pay. She had a business to run, and the Vitale family was not the kind of family you talked back to. Everyone in Chicago knew that. The Vitales ran the underworld with an iron fist wrapped in silk, and Alessandra was the only daughter of Don Emilio Vitale, the man whose name made grown men tremble. Insulting his daughter at her own wedding would be a death sentence, or at least a career-ending one. "I'll manage," Elena said, and turned away before Alessandra could respond. She walked back toward Marco, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly around her camera. She hated that her body betrayed her like this. Not the sweating, which was normal, but the shaking, which was fear. She wasn't afraid of Alessandra. She was afraid of what Alessandra represented, the kind of power that could crush someone like Elena without a second thought. "You okay?" Marco murmured as she reached him. "Fine," Elena said. "Keep shooting. We need coverage of the guests arriving. Focus on the older men. They're the ones who matter here." Marco nodded and moved away, his camera raised. Elena took a deep breath and lifted her own camera, scanning the room through the viewfinder. The lens was her shield, her way of making sense of the world. When she looked through it, she wasn't Elena Moretti, the fat photographer who sweated too much. She was an observer, a documentarian, someone who saw things others missed. It was her gift, the thing that had made her one of the most sought-after wedding photographers in Chicago, despite her size, despite the industry's prejudices. She saw reflections. She saw background gestures. She saw the hidden emotional connections that people thought they were concealing. And right now, as she panned her lens across the ballroom, she saw something that made her pause. It was nothing obvious, just a flicker of movement in the reflection of a polished silver tray, carried by a passing server. Alessandra, still on her platform, her hand reaching out, not toward her bridesmaids, but toward someone standing just out of frame. The gesture was quick, almost furtive, and then it was gone. Elena lowered her camera and looked directly at the platform, but Alessandra was now laughing with her bridesmaids again, both hands visible, nothing amiss. Elena frowned. She raised her camera again, zoomed in, but the moment had passed. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a bride reaching for a glass of champagne. But something about it nagged at her, a tiny splinter in the back of her mind. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Elena moved through the ballroom, capturing the details, the elaborate flower arrangements, the ice sculpture of two swans with their necks intertwined, the guests in their designer gowns and tailored suits. She photographed the groom, Luca Conti, when he arrived. A tall, broad-shouldered man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and eyes that held no warmth. He was the heir to the Conti family, the Vitales' closest allies, and his marriage to Alessandra was meant to unite the two most powerful crime families in the Midwest. It was a political marriage, everyone knew that, but the official story was that it was a love match. Elena didn't believe in love matches, not in this world. She photographed Luca, greeting Don Emilio, the old man frail but still radiating authority from his wheelchair. She photographed the bridesmaids fussing over Alessandra's train. She photographed the string quartet, the flower girls, the priest who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. And through it all, she kept her eye on the reflections. It was a habit she'd developed years ago, almost by accident. She had been photographing a wedding, where the bride's ex-boyfriend had shown up uninvited, and she had caught his reflection in a window just before he caused a scene. Since then, she had trained herself to watch the mirrors, the windows, the polished surfaces, the glasses of champagne. People forgot about reflections. They let their guard down. They revealed things they thought were hidden. The ceremony took place in the estate's private chapel, a small, ornate building filled with frescoes and the smell of incense. Elena positioned herself in the back, using a long lens to capture the vows, without being intrusive. Marco was in the front, getting the wide shots. The light was dim, the candles flickering, and Elena found herself sweating again despite the cool air. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and kept shooting. Alessandra walked down the aisle like a queen processing to her throne. Luca waited at the altar, his expression unreadable. The priest spoke, the vows were exchanged, and Elena captured it all. The ring sliding onto Alessandra's finger, the brief, almost reluctant kiss, the way Luca's hand tightened on Alessandra's waist, as if he were holding her in place, rather than embracing her. It was a beautiful ceremony, technically perfect, but there was no warmth in it, no love, just performance. After the ceremony, the guests moved back to the ballroom for the reception. Elena and Marco split up to cover different angles, Marco focusing on the guests, Elena on the bridal party. The first dance was scheduled for 8 o'clock, and until then, Elena circulated through the room, capturing candid moments. She photographed the toasts, the laughter, the clinking glasses. She photographed Don Emilio being wheeled around by a nurse, his sharp eyes missing nothing. She photographed Luca, standing with a group of men in dark suits, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their body language tense. And then she saw it again. She was near the bar, adjusting her settings, when she noticed Alessandra, standing near a side door, partially hidden by a velvet curtain. She was talking to someone, a man Elena didn't recognize. He was tall, with silver-streaked hair, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He wasn't a guest. Elena had photographed every guest during the arrival, and she would have remembered that scar. He was dressed like a server, but his posture was wrong. Too confident, too still. Elena raised her camera, zoomed in. Through the lens, she saw Alessandra's hand reach out and touch the man's wrist. It was a brief touch, almost accidental looking, but Elena saw the way Alessandra's fingers curled, the way the man's hand turned slightly to meet hers. It was intimate, it was secret, and then it was over. Alessandra pulled her hand back, smoothed her gown, and walked away. The man disappeared through the side door. Elena lowered her camera, her heart beating faster. She didn't know what she had just witnessed, but she knew it was something that wasn't supposed to happen at a wedding, where the bride had just married the heir to a crime family. She found Marco near the dessert table, photographing the elaborate cake. "I need you to do something," she said quietly. "There's a man, silver hair, scar on his face, dressed like a server. I need you to find him and photograph him, discreetly." Marco raised his eyebrows but didn't ask questions. That was one of the reasons Elena kept him around. "On it," he said, and slipped away into the crowd. Elena returned to her work, but her mind was racing. She told herself it could be nothing. A bride saying goodbye to an old friend. A server who happened to know the family. But the secrecy of it, the furtiveness, it didn't sit right. And there was something else, something she couldn't quite name. A feeling in her gut that had kept her alive and employed in a world that didn't want her. The first dance was announced at 8 o'clock sharp. The lights dimmed. The string quartet began to play a slow, romantic melody, and Luca led Alessandra onto the dance floor. The guests gathered around, raising their glasses, their faces lit with the soft glow of candlelight. Elena positioned herself at the edge of the dance floor, her camera ready. This was the shot every wedding album needed, the bride and groom, wrapped in each other's arms, the beginning of their forever. But through her lens, Elena saw something else. Luca's hand was on Alessandra's waist, but his grip was too tight, his fingers digging into the silk of her gown. Alessandra's smile was fixed, her eyes scanning the crowd over Luca's shoulder. And then, as the music swelled, Elena saw it. A reflection in the polished marble floor, distorted but unmistakable. Alessandra's hand, the one not resting on Luca's shoulder, was reaching out behind her back, and in the reflection, another hand reached back, a man's hand, with a scarred wrist. Elena's finger pressed the shutter release automatically, capturing the moment. She zoomed in, trying to get a clearer view, but the reflection was too distorted, the angle too oblique. She needed to see more. She moved around the dance floor, her heart pounding, her camera raised. She caught another reflection, this time in a silver champagne bucket on a nearby table. The same two hands, fingers intertwined for just a second before pulling apart. It wasn't romantic. Elena had photographed enough weddings to know what a secret romantic touch looked like. The lingering, the tenderness, the way lovers couldn't quite let go. This was different. This was transactional, a handoff, a signal. She kept shooting, her mind working furiously. Who was the scarred man? Why was Alessandra making contact with him during her first dance? And what had been passed between them? Elena reviewed her shots on the camera's small screen, zooming in on the reflections. The images were grainy, the lighting poor, but she could see enough. The hand clasp, the scarred wrist, the way Alessandra's fingers had curled around something small and dark. A flash drive? A piece of paper? She needed to see the images on a larger screen. She needed to edit them, enhance them, piece together what she had captured. The reception was scheduled to continue for another 3 hours, but Elena knew she couldn't wait that long. She found Marco near the bar and pulled him aside. "I need to go to the editing station," she said. "Something's happening. I caught something in the reflections during the first dance." Marco's eyes widened. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet, but I need you to keep shooting. And if you see the scarred man again, follow him. Get his face. Get everything." Marco nodded, his expression serious. "Be careful, Elena. These people, they're not like our usual clients." "I know," Elena said. "That's why I need to be sure before I do anything." She made her way to the small room off the ballroom that the Vitale estate had designated as the photography station. It was a former coat closet, barely large enough for a table and 2 chairs, but it had power outlets and a door that locked. Elena sat down, plugged her memory card into her laptop, and began to work. The images loaded slowly, the high-resolution files taking their time. Elena tapped her fingers on the table, her anxiety building. When the first image appeared, she leaned forward, her eyes scanning every pixel. The reflection in the marble floor was faint, but she could see the 2 hands, the scarred wrist, the small dark object being passed. She opened her editing software and began to enhance the image, adjusting the contrast, the brightness, the sharpness. Slowly, the details emerged. The object was a USB drive, small, black, unremarkable. But the fact that it was being passed during the first dance, in secret, told Elena it was anything but unremarkable. She pulled up the other images, the ones from the champagne bucket reflection, and enhanced those too. In one of them, she could see Alessandra's face in profile, her expression tense, her eyes fixed on something, or someone, across the room. Elena zoomed out and looked at the wider shots she had taken during the first dance. In the background, near the edge of the frame, she saw the scarred man. He was standing near a service door, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on Alessandra, and next to him, half hidden in shadow, was another man. This one was older, with a gaunt face and a cold, calculating expression. Elena didn't recognize him, but she knew his type. He was a man who gave orders, not took them. She pulled up her phone and did a quick search, her fingers flying over the screen. It took her 15 minutes to find a name. Vittorio De Luca, the head of the De Luca family, the Vitale's oldest and most bitter enemies. The De Lucas and the Vitales had been at war for 3 generations, a blood feud that had left bodies scattered across the Midwest, and Vittorio De Luca was standing in the shadows of the Vitale estate, watching Alessandra Vitale pass a USB drive to a scarred man during her wedding reception. Elena sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. This wasn't an affair. This was something much bigger. Alessandra wasn't cheating on Luca. She was betraying her entire family. She was working with the De Lucas, and whatever was on that USB drive, it was valuable enough to risk passing it during her own wedding, under the noses of her father, her husband, and a room full of made men. The door to the editing station opened, and Marco slipped inside, his face pale. "I found him," he said. "The scarred man. He's one of De Luca's lieutenants. I got a clear shot of his face." He handed Elena his memory card. "And I saw something else. During the first dance, I was near the back of the room, and I caught a reflection in a window. The same handclasp you saw, different angle." Elena took the memory card and inserted it into her laptop. Marco's images were sharper than hers, the angle better. In his reflection shot, the handclasp was unmistakable. The USB drive was clearly visible, and in the background, Vittorio De Luca's face was caught in the light, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "We have to tell someone," Marco said. This is huge. She's selling out her own family." "Tell who?" Elena said. "Don Emilio? Luca? They'll kill the messenger. You know how these people operate. We're nobody. We're the help. If we accuse the bride of treason without absolute proof, we'll be the ones who disappear." "We have proof," Marco said, gesturing at the laptop. "We have photos of a reflection," Elena said. "It's not enough. We need to know what's on that drive. We need to know exactly what she's doing. How are we supposed to find that out?" Elena stared at the screen, her mind racing. The reception was still going on. The slideshow was scheduled for 9:30, a montage of childhood photos and romantic moments, curated by Alessandra herself. Elena was supposed to project it onto the large screen at the front of the ballroom. It was a standard part of the wedding package, a way to entertain the guests while the bride and groom prepared for the cake cutting. But Elena had an idea, a dangerous, reckless idea that could get her killed or make her the most valuable person in the room. "I'm going to add something to the slideshow," she said. Marco stared at her. "You're going to what?" "I'm going to add the reflection photos, the ones from the first dance. I'm going to project them onto the screen in front of everyone." "Elena, that's insane. They'll kill you. They'll kill both of us." "Not if we do it right," Elena said. "Not if we make it look like an accident, a glitch in the system. By the time they realize what they're seeing, it'll be too late. Everyone in that room will have seen it. And once it's public, they can't make it disappear. They can't kill everyone." Marco shook his head, his expression torn between fear and admiration. "You're crazy. You know that, right?" "I've been called worse," Elena said. "By the bride herself, in fact. And I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being mocked and dismissed and treated like I don't matter. This is my chance to matter, to do something that actually makes a difference." "This isn't about making a difference," Marco said. "This is about revenge." Elena didn't deny it. Maybe it was revenge. Maybe she wanted to see Alessandra's perfect face crumble when her secret was exposed. Maybe she wanted to prove that the fat photographer who sweated too much was capable of bringing down a Mafia princess. But it was also about justice. Whatever Alessandra was doing, it was going to hurt people. It was going to start a war, and Elena had the power to stop it. "Help me," she said. "Or don't. But I'm doing this." Marco was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "What do you need me to do?" They worked quickly. Elena pulled up the slideshow file on her laptop and began to edit it, inserting the reflection photos at strategic points. She didn't want to make it obvious. She wanted it to look like a mistake, a corrupted file, a glitch in the system. She embedded the images deep in the slideshow, between innocent photos of Alessandra as a child and Luca at his confirmation. She set the timing so the images would flash on screen for only a few seconds before the slideshow moved on, just long enough to be seen, just long enough to be remembered. Marco stood guard at the door, watching for anyone who might interrupt them. The minutes ticked by. Elena's hands were steady on the keyboard, her mind focused. She had never done anything like this before. She had never taken a risk this big. But as she worked, she felt a strange sense of calm. This was what she was meant to do. This was why she had spent years training herself to see what others missed. Not to capture beautiful wedding photos, but to capture the truth. At 9:15, Elena finished the slideshow and saved it to a USB drive. She stood up, her legs shaky, her heart pounding. "It's done," she said. "Let's go." They made their way back to the ballroom. The reception was in full swing. The guests drunk and laughing. The string quartet replaced by a DJ playing top 40 hits. Alessandra and Luca were sitting at the head table, their expressions carefully neutral. Don Emilio had been wheeled to a corner, where he was holding court with a group of elderly men. The scarred man was nowhere to be seen, but Elena knew he was still somewhere in the building, waiting. Elena approached the AV technician, a nervous young man with acne and a bad haircut. "I have the slideshow," she said, handing him the USB drive. "It's ready to go." The technician nodded and inserted the drive into his system. Elena watched as the file loaded, her stomach churning. She glanced at Marco, who was standing near the back of the room, his camera raised, but his eyes on her. He gave her a small nod. The lights dimmed. The DJ announced the slideshow, and the guests turned their attention to the large screen at the front of the ballroom. Alessandra smiled, a practiced, photogenic smile, and leaned into Luca. The first image appeared, a baby photo of Alessandra, chubby and laughing. The guests cooed. The slideshow continued, a parade of childhood memories, family vacations, awkward teenage years. Elena stood near the AV station, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes on the screen. And then it happened. The screen flickered. The image of Alessandra at her sweet 16 was replaced, for just a moment, by something else. A reflection, 2 hands clasped, a scarred wrist, a USB drive. The image was grainy, the lighting poor, but the meaning was unmistakable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alessandra's smile froze. Luca's head snapped toward the screen. The slideshow moved on, returning to the innocent photos, but the damage was done. The murmur grew louder. Guests turned to each other, whispering. Don Emilio's sharp eyes narrowed, and then the screen flickered again, and another reflection appeared. This one from Marco's angle, clearer, sharper, Vittorio De Luca's face visible in the background. Someone gasped. A woman screamed. Luca stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Alessandra's face had gone pale. Her hands were gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "It's nothing," she said, her voice high and strained. "It's a mistake, a technical glitch." But no one believed her. The images kept flashing, interspersed with the innocent photos. A grotesque slideshow of betrayal. Elena watched as the room descended into chaos. Men in dark suits were moving toward the AV station, their hands reaching inside their jackets. Don Emilio was shouting something in Italian, his frail body trembling with rage. Luca had grabbed Alessandra by the arm, his grip so tight she winced. And then the screen went black. The AV technician had pulled the plug, his face white with terror. But it was too late. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. Elena stepped back from the AV station, her heart hammering. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. Now she had to survive the aftermath. The next few minutes were a blur of motion and noise. Guests were fleeing the ballroom, their faces a mix of shock and fear. The men in dark suits were fanning out, searching for the source of the images. Marco appeared at Elena's side, his camera still raised, still shooting. "We need to get out of here," he hissed. "Not yet," Elena said. She was watching Alessandra, who was now surrounded by Luca and several of Don Emilio's men. The bride's composure had shattered. She was crying, pleading, her hands reaching for Luca, who pushed her away. The scarred man had appeared near the service door, but he was being blocked by two of the Vitale guards. Vittorio De Luca was nowhere to be seen. He must have slipped out the moment the images appeared. And then Don Emilio's wheelchair was being pushed toward Elena. The old man's eyes were fixed on her, and despite his frailty, there was a power in his gaze that made Elena's blood run cold. He stopped a few feet away, his nurse hovering nervously behind him. "You," he said, his voice a rasp. "The photographer. You did this." It wasn't a question. Elena met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "I did." Don Emilio was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Why?" "Because it was the truth," Elena said. "And because your daughter humiliated me in front of everyone. But mostly because it was the truth." A ghost of a smile flickered across Don Emilio's lips. "The truth," he repeated. "You think the truth matters in this world?" "It matters to me," Elena said. Don Emilio studied her for another long moment. Then he turned to one of his men. "Bring Alessandra to my study, and find De Luca. I want him found before sunrise." He looked back at Elena. "You will come with me. Both of you." He gestured at Marco. They were escorted through the estate, past the fleeing guests and the grim-faced guards, to a wood-paneled study, filled with books and the smell of cigar smoke. Don Emilio was positioned behind a massive desk, his nurse dismissed. Alessandra was brought in a few minutes later, her makeup streaked with tears, her gown wrinkled. Luca followed, his face a mask of cold fury. "Explain," Don Emilio said to his daughter. Alessandra's chin lifted, a flicker of defiance breaking through her fear. "You wouldn't understand," she said. "You and your old-fashioned ways. The De Lucas offered me something you never could, a partnership, a future, where I'm not just a pawn to be married off." "You betrayed your family," Luca said, his voice low and dangerous. "You betrayed me." "You were never my family," Alessandra spat. "This marriage was a business deal. You know that as well as I do. I just made a better deal." Don Emilio raised a hand, silencing them both. He looked at Elena. "Show me the photos." Elena pulled out her laptop and opened the files. She showed him the reflections, the hand clasp, the USB drive. She showed him Marco's images, the clear shot of Vittorio De Luca's face. Don Emilio studied them in silence, his expression unreadable. "What was on the drive?" he asked Alessandra. Alessandra didn't answer. One of the guards stepped forward and whispered something in Don Emilio's ear. The old man's face darkened. "Account numbers," he said. "Offshore accounts. She was transferring our assets to the De Lucas during her own wedding." Luca made a sound like a wounded animal. Alessandra closed her eyes. "Take her away," Don Emilio said. "I'll deal with her later." Alessandra was dragged out of the study, her protests fading down the hallway. Luca followed, his shoulders rigid. Elena and Marco were left alone with Don Emilio. "You've done me a service," Don Emilio said, his eyes on Elena. "But you've also embarrassed my family in front of half of Chicago. That is not something I can overlook." Elena's heart sank. She had known this was a possibility. She had hoped that exposing the truth would earn her some measure of protection. But she was still an outsider, still expendable. However, Don Emilio continued, "You have a talent, a rare talent. You see things others miss. That is valuable." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "I want you to work for me, not as a wedding photographer, as an observer, someone who watches and reports, someone who sees the truth before it becomes a threat." Elena stared at him. "You want me to be a spy? I want you to be my eyes." Don Emilio said, "You will be well compensated. You will be protected, and you will never have to photograph another wedding again." It was an offer she should have refused. It was an offer that would tie her to a world of violence and danger and moral compromise. But it was also an offer that meant she would never be invisible again, never be mocked, never be dismissed. "I'll think about it," Elena said. Don Emilio smiled, a real smile this time. "No, you won't. You've already made your choice. You made it the moment you put those photos in the slideshow." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single photograph, a printed copy of one of Elena's reflection shots, the hand clasp, the scarred wrist. "This is the only image from tonight that matters," he said, the moment truth entered the room. "Keep it, as a reminder of what you're capable of." Elena took the photograph. Her hands were steady now. She looked at the image, at the two hands clasped in secret, at the betrayal frozen in time. She had captured that. She had exposed that. She had changed the course of a Mafia war, with nothing but her camera and her refusal to look away. "Thank you," she said. "So is." Don Emilio nodded. "You may go. My men will escort you out. And, Elena." She paused at the door. "The bride was wrong about you," he said. "You don't sweat under pressure. You shine." Elena walked out of the study, Marco at her side, the photograph clutched in her hand. The ballroom was empty now, the flowers wilting, the ice sculpture melting. The wedding was over, the marriage was over. But for Elena, something new was beginning, something dangerous, something powerful. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, being mocked, being told she was too fat, too slow, too insignificant to matter. But tonight, she had proven them all wrong. She had seen what no one else could see. She had spoken the truth when everyone else was content with lies. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance, Elena Moretti smiled. She was no longer just a wedding photographer. She was a woman who could bring down empires with a single click of her shutter. And she was just getting started.